Scenes contain violence. Viewer discretion is advised. New Year's Day, 1888. A father lies in blood-soaked snow, his bare feet frozen. But he doesn't feel the pain, only despair. He'd just witnessed his 2 children mowed down by gunfire. His wife struck down with fatal force. But this is not a fictional horror story. This was real life in the Appalachian Mountains. Let's rewind an hour. A family is startled awake as rifle fire splits the frozen air. At the same time, flames climb the walls of their log cabin in Pike County, Kentucky. Inside, Calvin McCoy jumps out of bed. For a second, he thinks it's a dream, a nightmare. But it's not. He's barely 16 and tries to shield his sister, Alife. As gunfire rips through their house, Calvin sees his mother Sally being dragged into the yard and beaten with a rifle butt until her skull cracks. Their father, Randolph McCoy, flees barefoot into the darkness, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. That's the last thing he ever saw. By dawn, Calvin and Alife lie motionless. Sally McCoy will survive, but she'll never be the same. The men who did this weren't strangers. They were neighbors. Some had even danced at the same weddings, buried their dead in the same churchyards, fought in the same war. Welcome, Darklings. Long before modern headlines, history was filled with brutal, pure evil crimes that will make you question your humanity. Subscribe and step into the shadows with us. You'll never see history the same way again. When I first stumbled across this story, I thought it was just another folklore tale about hillbillies and moonshine. But it's not. In my research, I found that this family feud even reached the United States Supreme Court and redefined laws on how states could hunt fugitives across borders. The New Year's murders weren't the start, but they were the breaking point. And after those children were shot dead, all-out war erupted in the Appalachian Mountains for nearly 30 years. In the late 1800s, the Appalachian Mountains were lawless. You could be arrested on one side of the river and executed on the other before your family even knew you were missing. You could win in court and still be shot dead in your own doorway. You could be torn from your young lover simply because of the name you were born with. This family war would change American society forever. To understand what led to this bloody battle, you must understand the terrain it was fought on. The Tug Fork Valley sits where Kentucky bleeds into West Virginia, a river that's both a border and a battleground. The Hatfields were a family that farmed the West Virginia side. The McCoys worked the Kentucky side. Between them ran cold water. And after the Civil War, even colder blood. But before then, they were allies, friends. Some of them even fought together. But you must remember, this was Appalachia in the 1860s. No paved roads, no telephones. The nearest sheriff might be a day's ride away, assuming he wasn't your cousin or your enemies. Out here, the law was whoever could enforce it. Justice was whoever owned the courthouse. Both families were Confederate sympathizers, yet some sons had worn Union blue, which was unforgivable. Thus, when the war ended, those divisions didn't heal. They festered. Brother had fought brother. Neighbor had betrayed neighbor. And in the mountains, people remembered. Yet this feud wasn't really about the Civil War. It wasn't about a stolen pig either, though that's what the newspapers would claim. The truth is darker and far more complicated. Timber companies were arriving, waiving contracts that illiterate farmers couldn't read. Railroads wanted the coal beneath the mountains. Land that had been in families for generations was suddenly worth money. Real money. And the lawyers circling like vultures knew it. Devil Anse Hatfield had already made a fortune selling timber rights. Perry Klein, a McCoy ally, had lost thousands of acres to the Hatfields in a suspicious lawsuit. It was another kind of war, one that the innocent farmers didn't understand. So when tensions rose, it wasn't just about pride. It was about power, property, and the question neither state wanted to answer. Whose law applies when a river is a state line, and your judge is your cousin? The people didn't know it at the time, but they were stepping into a new world, a new age, and their blood would usher it in. The first murder happened before the feud even had a name. January 1865. The Civil War had just ended. Asa Harmon McCoy, Randolph's younger brother, came home from the Union Army, limping from a broken leg sustained in battle. In his mind, he was a hero. Butte had fought for the North. That made him a traitor in the eyes of many. Weeks later, Asa disappeared. They found his body in a cave, shot through the chest. The killers were believed to be the Logan Wildcats, a Confederate guerrilla band that had terrorized the region during the war. The leader? Jim Vance, Devil Anse Hatfield's uncle. Devil Anse had an alibi. He'd been miles away tending to business. Yet everyone knew Jim Vance didn't act alone. Everyone knew who gave the orders, even if no one could prove it. Randolph McCoy buried his brother and said nothing. What could he say? The law didn't come this far into the mountains. And even if it did, the Hatfields were the law. For 13 years, the McCoys swallowed their rage. But rage doesn't disappear. It waits. 12 years later, in the autumn of 1878, Randolph McCoy noticed one of his pigs was missing. He accused Floyd Hatfield, a cousin by marriage, of stealing it. Floyd denied it. The pig, Floyd said, had always been his. It bore his mark. A trial was convened. The judge, Reverend Anderson, Preacher Anse Hatfield. The jury, 6 Hatfields and 6 McCoys. The key witness was Bill Staton, a man with blood ties to both families. He testified that the pig belonged to Floyd. The jury deadlocked, then broke in Floyd's favor. Randolph McCoy walked out of that courthouse humiliated. To him, the trial wasn't justice. It was a performance. The Hatfields controlled the jury, controlled the judge, controlled the outcome. Again, he bit his tongue. He didn't want any more violence because of it. But, in his heart, he knew it was too late. 2 years later, Randolph's relatives Sam and Paris McCoy confronted Bill Staton in the woods. They demanded to know why he'd sided with the Hatfields. They reminded him about what happened to Asa. They said it wasn't fair. An argument erupted, and tempers flared. Both sides reached for their guns, but this time, the McCoy were faster. Shots were fired. Staton died. The McCoys were only getting started though, and not long after they'd repeatedly attacked and killed. But first, Sam and Paris had to face trial. At their hearing, the McCoy brothers claimed self-defense, and by a stroke of luck or bribery, the jury acquitted them. In their eyes, they were beating the Hatfields at their own game. Randolph didn't want this, but what choice did he have? Now the damage was done, and there was no going back. The Hatfields believed the McCoys were thieves who'd murdered a witness. The McCoys believed the Hatfields were also murderers that had rigged the system and would never face consequences. Both were right, and neither would back down. But then something happened that stunned both sides and changed everything. On Election Day in 1880, 2 years after the hog trial, Rosanna McCoy crossed the river to Blackberry Creek. She was 18, dark-haired, and restless. As she was old enough to vote now, her father Randolph had brought her along to the festivities. It was a mix of voting, drinking, and socializing that drew families from both sides of the Tug Fork. It was a day of celebration, and that's where she met John Hatfield. While Randolph was drinking and talking to his friends, Rosanna and John crept away together. They knew it was forbidden. They knew their parents would be furious, but they didn't care. The thrill made it even more exciting. To make things worse, John wasn't just any Hatfield. He was Devil Anse's eldest son. He was tall, handsome, and charming in the way that ruins lives. He wore fine clothes and had a reputation with women. Rosanna should have known better. She didn't. By nightfall, she'd left with him. She moved into the Hatfield household, sharing John's bed, defying her father's fury. Randolph McCoy didn't take it well. He secured warrants for John's arrest on old charges. Anything to get him into custody. When John came to visit Rosanna at a neutral meeting place, he was ambushed and arrested. Rosanna faced a choice: betray her family or lose the man she loved. She chose John's. After the McCoys had taken John's, Rosanna rode through the night to warn Devil Anse. He assembled an armed rescue party, intercepted the lawman, and freed his son at gunpoint. The constables retreated, humiliated, but the McCoys weren't giving up that easily. However, it'd take them 2 years, and on another election day, a Hatfield would pay in blood. But before then, Rosanna returned to the Hatfield home, expecting gratitude. Instead, she found abandonment, cold shoulders. Nobody would speak to her. She sought out Johns. Surely he still loved her. But no, he had grown tired of her. Worse, he'd begun courting her cousin, Nancy McCoy. Within months, Johns married Nancy. Rosanna was pregnant, alone, and disowned by both families. Her father refused to take her back. The Hatfields wanted nothing to do with her. She gave birth to a daughter who died in infancy. Rosanna McCoy spent the rest of her short life as a ghost, a living reminder that love between Hatfields and McCoys was a death sentence. Yet her heartbreak would pale compared to what came next. August 1882, another election day, another gathering at Blackberry Creek. Whiskey flowed, old grudges simmered. Talbot McCoy, Randolph's son, got into an argument with Ellison Hatfield over a debt. Voices rose, fists flew. Ellison Hatfield was Devil Ance's brother, a large, powerful man, not easily intimidated. Yet he was outnumbered. Talbot, his brother Farmer, and their younger brother Randolph Jr. fell on Ellison in a frenzy. They stabbed him more than 20 times, chest, back, abdomen, then shot him for good measure. Ellison collapsed, bleeding into the dirt. He wouldn't die immediately, but everyone knew the wounds were fatal. Authorities arrested the 3 McCoy brothers and began transporting them to the county jail in Pikeville, Kentucky. They'd face trial. They'd hang. That should have been the end of it. Yet Devil Anse Hatfield had other plans. He assembled a posse of Hatfields and sympathizers, heavily armed men who rode through the night. They intercepted the constables on the road, surrounding them with rifles raised. Devil Anse made his position clear. If Ellison died, the McCoy brothers would die. Not in a courtroom, not by a jury, by Hatfield justice. The constables had no choice. They surrendered their prisoners. For 2 days, the McCoy brothers were held captive while Ellison Hatfield clung to life. When word came that Ellison had finally succumbed, Devil Anse gave the order. The 3 McCoy brothers were dragged to a stand of pawpaw bushes near the Kentucky-West Virginia line. They were tied to the trees. Then the Hatfields raised their rifles and fired in unison, volley after volley, until the prisoners hung limp in their bindings. Randolph McCoy arrived too late. He found his sons' bodies riddled with bullets, their blood soaking into the roots. He cried, bitter tears of anger and sorrow. This was the point of no return. 3 men had been executed without trial, without mercy. The question now wasn't whether the law could restore order. The question was whether the law existed at all. This was still 6 years before the fateful horror of New Year's night, 1888. In 1883, Kentucky indicted nearly 20 Hatfields for the pawpaw murders. The governor demanded extradition. West Virginia refused. Governor E. Willis Wilson declared that his state would not surrender its citizens to Kentucky's mob justice. Devil Anse Hatfield, grateful for the protection, named his next son, Willis, in the governor's honor. For 5 years, the feud simmered. Occasional shootings, stolen livestock, midnight threats. Both sides armed themselves, waiting for the next spark. Randolph McCoy, meanwhile, had found an ally, Perry Cline. Cline was a lawyer and a cousin to the McCoys. Years earlier, he'd lost thousands of acres of timberland to Devil Anse in a lawsuit that reeked of corruption. Now he saw an opportunity for revenge. Cline lobbied Kentucky's new governor, Simon Bolivar Buckner, to take aggressive action. He argued that the Hatfields weren't just criminals, they were an insult to Kentucky's sovereignty. Meanwhile, one man who hadn't yet entered the feud was watching from afar. He was a friend of the McCoys and had heard all about the Hatfields' crimes and corruption. He was itching for a fight, but he knew he had to bide his time. Thus, in 1887, Governor Buckner made a bold move. He commissioned the man, Frank Phillips, also known as Bad Frankus, a special deputy with authority to hunt fugitives across state lines. It was the moment he'd been waiting for. Bad Frank wasn't interested in due process. He was interested in blood. Newspapers seized on the story. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. National outlets painted the feud as a barbaric spectacle of backwoods savagery. They described Appalachians as illiterate, violent hillbillies trapped in a medieval cycle of revenge. The sensationalism worked. The feud became a symbol of everything civilized America wanted to distance itself from. Yet the reporters missed the real story. This wasn't just mountain madness. It was a chess game played by governors, lawyers, and timber barons, with poor families as the pawns. The question remained, when states disagree, who stops the killing? Nobody knew the answer. And that brings us to the new year, 1888. The night of January 1st, 1888, was bitterly cold. Randolph McCoy's family huddled inside their cabin, celebrating the new year. The fire crackled. Children slept in the loft. Randolph and his wife were drunk and merry. They knew Frank was out hunting the Hatfields. They weren't Randolph's problem anymore. But, just after midnight, figures emerged from the woods. Cap Hatfield, Devil Ance's son, led the group. With him were Jim Vance and a half-dozen others, all armed. They surrounded the cabin, rifles raised. Someone shouted for Randolph to come out. He refused. The Hatfields opened fire. Bullets punched through the log walls. Sally McCoy screamed for her children to take cover. Calvin, 16, tried to shield his younger sister Alifair. Randolph grabbed a rifle and returned fire through the window. Then the Hatfields set the house ablaze. Flames crawled up the walls. Smoke filled the cabin. The family had seconds to decide: burn alive or run into the crossfire. They ran. Sally McCoy burst through the door, hands raised. One of the Hatfields struck her across the skull with a rifle butt. She collapsed in the snow, gravely injured. Calvin tried to flee. A bullet caught him in the back. He died instantly. Alifair stumbled into the yard, disoriented. Another shot. She fell beside her brother. Randolph McCoy escaped into the darkness, barefoot and bleeding. Behind him, his home burned. His wife lay unconscious. His children lay dead. By morning, the news had spread. 2 children, murdered. A woman beaten nearly to death. A family destroyed. National outrage exploded. Even those who dismissed the feud as mountain justice were horrified. This wasn't a fight between men. This was the slaughter of innocents. Kentucky's Governor Buckner authorized Frank Phillips to do whatever was necessary to bring the Hatfields to justice. It was no longer a feud. It was a manhunt. Frank Phillips raised a posse of McCoys, Kentucky lawmen, and hired guns. They crossed into West Virginia, illegally, hunting for Hatfields. On January 10th, they found Jim Vance near Mate Creek. Vance tried to run. Phillips shot him dead. 9 days later, the posse caught up with a larger group of Hatfields near Grapevine Creek. Cap Hatfield, his uncle Valentine, and several others had taken defensive positions in the woods. A firefight erupted. Bullets shredded tree bark. Men shouted orders. The air filled with gunpowder smoke. The Hatfields were outnumbered. Phillips's men flanked them, cutting off escape routes. 1 Hatfield was killed. Several were wounded. Valentine Hatfield and his sons were captured. One of Phillips's deputies, Bill Dempsey, was shot through the chest. He died hours later. The prisoners were dragged back across the state line to Pikeville, Kentucky. Some had broken bones, all expected to hang. But it wasn't over. West Virginia issued murder warrants for Frank Phillips and his men. They'd killed on West Virginia soil without legal authority. Yet Kentucky celebrated Phillips as a hero. The question now wasn't just moral. It was constitutional. If the arrests were illegal, do the trials still stand? The trials began in 1889. 7 Hatfields and their allies were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. One man, Ellison Cotton Top Mounts, was singled out for execution. Mounts was an illegitimate Hatfield relative, intellectually disabled and easily manipulated. Under pressure, he confessed to killing Alifair McCoy, Randolph's daughter. Historians doubt he did, yet the state needed a hanging. On February 18th, 1890, thousands gathered to watch Ellison Mounts climb the gallows in Pikeville. He was 26 years old. The rope snapped his neck. The crowd cheered. Meanwhile, West Virginia sued Kentucky in federal court, arguing that Frank Phillips had kidnapped the defendants. The case, Mann versus Justice, reached the United States Supreme Court. Kentucky's argument was simple. The men were murderers. How they were captured was irrelevant. West Virginia's argument was equally simple. Kidnapping cannot confer legal jurisdiction. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in Kentucky's favor. Justice Stephen Field wrote the majority opinion. Even if the arrest was illegal, Kentucky had the right to prosecute. Federal courts would not interfere with state criminal proceedings. Justice Bradley dissented, warning that the ruling legitimized vigilante justice and extra-legal extradition. He was right, yet the precedent stood. The Hatfields would remain in prison. The McCoys had won. But at what cost? Could this really be called justice? For over a century, people have repeated the same story. The Hatfield-McCoy feud started over a stolen pig. That's a myth. The hog trial was symbolic, but it wasn't the cause. Still, it represented something deeper, a breakdown in trust, a rigged system, and the humiliation of a proud man called Randolph, who had no one to turn to. In truth, the real drivers were far more complex. First, the Civil War. Asa Harmon McCoy's murder in 1865 was an act of wartime revenge that set the tone for everything that followed. Union versus Confederate, brother versus brother. Second, economic insecurity. Timber speculators and coal companies were reshaping Appalachia. Families like the Hatfields were getting rich. Families like the McCoys were being squeezed out. Land disputes fueled personal grudges. Third, political power. Local offices, sheriffs, justices of the peace were controlled by kinship networks. The Hatfields dominated West Virginia politics. The McCoys had allies in Kentucky. When law enforcement was corrupt, violence became inevitable. Then there was the media sensationalism. National newspapers needed a simple story: ignorant hillbillies killing each other over livestock. But they were ordinary people, and timber rights, political corruption, and interstate legal battles were too complicated to sell papers. Some modern writers have speculated that a genetic disease, von Hippel-Lindau syndrome, caused aggression in the McCoy family. These claims lack credible evidence and should be viewed skeptically. At the end of the day, this feud was about a failed system, one that favored the powerful and left the powerless with no options but violence. But as cruel as this story is, it helped wake people up to the fact that the system needed changing, and in time, it did. After the trials, the killing stopped. Devil Anse Hatfield grew old, wealthy from timber deals, and strangely reflective. In 1911, at 72, he was baptized in a river, seeking forgiveness for a lifetime of blood. Randolph McCoy died poor and alone in 1914, operating a ferry and nursing grudges until the end. The families drifted apart. Some left the mountains. Some stayed, rebuilding lives and trying to forget about the feud. For decades, the story lived on in newspapers, novels, and eventually television. It became an American legend. Yet something unexpected happened. In 1976, descendants of the two families met at a picnic in Kentucky. Jim McCoy, great-grandson of Samuel McCoy, and Willis Hatfield, last surviving son of Devil Anse, shook hands and symbolically buried a hatchet. Willis joked that after drinking with a couple of McCoy boys, he'd found them to be good fellows. In 2003, the families signed a formal truce. Governors from both West Virginia and Kentucky issued proclamations recognizing Hatfield-McCoy Reconciliation Day. It was theater, of course. The feud had ended a century earlier, yet the gesture mattered. It said, "We choose peace over violence." This true story shows that even the most bloody feud can be settled within a generation or two. But for Appalachia, this bloody chapter will never be forgotten.